the time we have together. I'm going to hand over to Josh, who'll be leading the learning and research portion of this action learning set today. Over to you, Josh.
Super, thanks, Louise. And yeah, just to second that welcome. It's lovely to see everybody. It's lovely to have everybody back together again for one of these action learning sets. Our session today is a little bit of looking back and a little bit of looking forward. I think I'm going to be in charge of that little bit of looking back to start us off with, and just spending 10-15 minutes or so having a bit of a reflect on some of the messages that we've seen coming out of your individual learning and research reports. We're in the very lucky and privileged position of having seen what's been said in those reports for all 5 of you. So what we wanted to do is reflect back some of the emerging sort of thinking that we've taken from that as a bit of a prelude to the programme report that will be developed later this month. And I think once we've done that, we sort of plan to spend about 15-20 minutes or so on that topic. We'll then hand over to Rachel and colleagues from the Design Council, who are going to be leading that more forward-thinking part of, well, based on all of that learning, what do you want to take away as those sort of key tips and things that people might want to be aware of looking ahead? So there's a bit of looking back, a bit of looking forward. Just a couple of little updates and bits of housekeeping around those reports that we've shared with you. So I think there was just a couple of questions had come back to us and other colleagues about what the plans are in terms of where those reports will go. I just want to confirm with everyone together that the intention is that the programme report, so the summary report that all of the evidence will sit with, the intention is for that to be a publicly available document, and you'll have a chance to have a look at that before that is made available to everybody. In terms of the reports that have been sent to you, those are for you guys, and those you can share them as far and as wide as you'd like to, but they won't be made publicly available via us and the Health Foundation and the LGA. Of course, we hope that they're packed full of useful learning and that you'll want to share them with colleagues around your systems, and we'd encourage you to do so. But just to let you know, in terms of when it comes to getting those all signed off, that's what the plan will be. So just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about that before I start. Fab. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about now, I've been scanning through all of your reports again over the last couple of days, and I have sort of 6 initial reflections at this stage of things that sort of jumped out to me as interesting, things that sort of struck me looking at you guys all in the round. I wanted just to share those with you today. And by all means, people should feel free to jump in, question these, suggest if I've got anything wrong, but these are the sorts of ideas that are going to sort of feature in that program level report that, as I say, we're working on at the moment and will be produced over the next month. I've broadly tried to order these in something I think is logical, which is I'm going to sort of start with some reflections about what you guys seem to think about when you think about what your systems are, and how you define those. We'll talk a little bit about some reflections about some of the ways in which you've tried to change your complex systems and how that's happened in practice. And then a few reflections on the things that have helped you do that or occasionally made things more challenging. So that's the sort of order we're going to try and flow through. Hopefully that's going to make sense as we go. But I think I should stop wittering with this preamble, and I should get on and share some of those findings. I think that's what I should probably do. So in terms of where our first sort of reflection, I think when we look at you as 5 sites who have taken on this challenge of adopting a complex system approach, I think what we're struck by is that after 3 years, in many ways, you're still quite distinctive from one another. There hasn't been a sort of a super obvious convergence of you all to exactly the same sort of shape and approach. I think we can see that there's variation in terms of how you've drawn your systems. Some of you, it's very much about the geography of a place, places that are of different sizes and different features. Some of you, it's been organizing it around different relationships, different policy areas and different networks. And I suppose our reflection on all of this for other local authorities and public bodies that might want to adopt this kind of way of working is actually there's no one single way to define a complex system. And what we can see with all of you is actually that you've chosen a system to draw a system that makes sense of your context and the particular challenge that you're trying to tackle. I think it's really interesting for us that that's the case, because it means that there's not a sort of off-the-shelf approach that that other local authorities can necessarily take, and we can see that depending on where you started and how you drew those systems have often led you in particular directions rather than other ones. But what's really interesting is that actually there's a diversity of approaches here in terms of how you have approached that question of what is our system, what's the system that we're trying to change here, how do we describe that, what are the features of it, who's in it, who's not in it, what's in it, what's not in it. So I think that's our starting point is after 3 years, you're still quite a diverse bunch, which is really exciting and interesting because it offers people a lot of different opportunities, we think. So if that's how you're thinking about your systems and what they actually are, I think then the next question we had is about how do you go about changing those systems? And I suppose we again reflected that there was quite a degree of diversity in your approaches in terms of what actions you've taken, where you've focused your energy and your time. But there are also some commonalities about what you've done. I think looking across all of you, despite your different configurations and your different starting points on this journey, we can see that partnerships and intelligence sharing and intelligence gathering have been pretty central to almost everybody's work. You can see that throughout. This is perhaps not entirely surprising. It's something I think we would have anticipated, that relationships would have sat at the core of this work, and that sharing information, sharing ideas, less of that siloed thinking would be a feature. But I think we can see that there is definitely strong evidence that that is exactly the case. What we expected is very much come through clearly. I think what's equally interesting, though, and in fact perhaps more interesting, is we can see the way you're working your systems. You work them in many different places. It's not just one set of activities, one set of relationships, one information sharing in one area. You're working all over your system. And actually, you're often working at different levels of your system as well. So you're trying to build those relationships and those structural things and getting the right people around the table. But while you're doing that, you're also trying to affect their beliefs and try and affect what they think is the way the world works and what's important and what's not important. And you're trying to push them to reorientate their goals at the same time. And what I suppose we've really identified across all of you is this need for an energetic approach, which is in lots of places, doing lots of things and operating at lots of levels simultaneously. And that's how you're pushing through change. It's not by just doing one thing. It's by doing a lot of different things at the same time with different groups of people throughout your system. So I think that's a really exciting and interesting thing. I think it's instructive for people going forward about how you need to approach this kind of task. So if that's how you define your system and that's how you've approached, sort of broadly speaking, changing your system, what has that change looked like? I think it's interesting when we reflect back on what you expected to happen at the very beginning of this. Almost everybody was very, very keen to tell us, don't expect the world. We're not expecting to change population outcomes at the end of this. You know, this is going to be the start of a journey. We're not expecting to reach the end of the journey. But I think what is really fascinating is despite that being your expectation, And despite some of the really challenging circumstances under which you've tried to implement some of this work, COVID at the very beginning, we try not to think about it too much, but it was there and it was real. It wasn't done with when we were starting this journey together. The cost of living crisis and all the things that have come with that have been operating throughout the background of all of this. Actually, despite all of those things, actually, in almost all of the sites, we can see that you have achieved some changes to the character of your systems, some smaller, some larger. And that's often happening again at different places in your system and at different levels. So we can see those relationships have formed. In some places, those have gone really far and turned into really strong partnerships and quite formalized now. We can see people changing the way they're thinking about particular challenges. And actually, we can see people who've gone further and been able to get those changes in thoughts into policy documents, into strategies, into goals, into practice as well. So you can see that although we don't necessarily think there's been dramatic shifts related to this work in terms of outcomes at a population level, what we can see is, the theories of change that you set out, you would do these actions, you would change these characteristics of your system, and hopefully in the future you would get those outcomes. We can see that you have in fact done those actions and you are progressing through your theory of change in a way that can hopefully give you confidence that you're headed in the right direction. I think that's a really positive story to tell, because you are on a long journey and you have to keep people with you. You have to be able to demonstrate that actually you're ticking off the steps along the way, and I think we can see good evidence that is happening in a number of places. In terms of just that fourth finding, that one of the things we wanted to highlight about how your systems changed, a lot of that's often, not in all places, but often been around trying to promote a greater degree of autonomy within your system, whether it's voluntary sector organizations, different statutory partners, members of your community, trying to sort of build up their confidence as much as their skills and their capacity by bringing them together, allowing them to do more, trying to give them more agency within your system to achieve more. So actually, often it's not about really changing what's in your system. It's about trying to maximize what's already there. This has taken different shapes in different places, depending on where your focus has been and on the energy. I mean, there's great examples of this in a very sort of community-led way in some of the work that Coyce Bright has seen in Blythe and Stainforth in particular. But actually, in other places, I think this lesson also carries through in a number of different parts of the work too. So there's this thing about agency, about how that is part of the change story for all of you. I think then just two reflections that are in a slightly different place that are connected. I think it's how you talk about systems and how you talk about the idea of complexity. Those are the final two I just wanted to rest on today. The first, then, how you're talking about systems. What is really interesting to us is you guys all do it kind of differently. You all still have a slightly different language for systems across the site, so that we can see more shared language. We can see the influence of the work you guys have done together, and with the Design Council, elements of the framework we use for the learning and research work have sort of come in and added some consistency. You all do it slightly differently. And I think the other thing that's interesting about it is how much you talk to people about systems. So in some places, it's we have an idea of systems, but we don't really talk to our partners and the community about systems. It's kind of in the background. It informs what we're thinking about, but actually we don't want it to put up a sort of academic wall between us and the people we want to work with. In other places, that's been slightly taken on slightly differently, where you've decided, okay, we need to have some conversations that have sort of systems content in it. So we're going to find new ways of phrasing that. We're going to invest time in sort of accessible language and trying to get the point across, not necessarily using the sort of academic language, but using a language that expresses the same thing to people in a more sort of colloquial and accessible way. And in some places, actually, you've sort of not necessarily using the sort of language of complex systems, but using other language that has strong connections to complex system ideas, but that things that we're already more familiar with. So, for example, around sort of asset-based community development language, stuff that actually that's sort of language quite a lot of professionals are already quite au fait with. They know what that means. They feel good about and comfortable with that. So we see people with a different approach to how they want to talk about what their complex system approach is, what sort of language they use depending on who they're talking to. And I suppose it's just interesting that you've all landed at slightly different places. This might be a reflection of the different people you're trying to work with and different people you're trying to influence in your systems. But I think nevertheless, I think for other areas that might be thinking about this, it sort of demonstrates there's a selection of approaches that you could take if you want to do this kind of work. And I suppose I just want to extend that point for my final point just on the question of complexity. And I suppose we've identified complex system processes all over the place in your work. You know, there's complexity. It seems to us, based on what you're telling us, it's kind of a fact of life of this way of working. As you change one thing, something over here changes in another way or an unexpected way. It's something you're just having to deal with all of the time. What I think is interesting is, unlike the sort of the systems part of complex systems, where some of you are talking about this in different ways, the complexity bit is kind of less present in how you talk about it on the whole. Not everyone in exactly the same way. You're all on a sort of a bit of a spectrum of this. But I suppose we hear less use of the language around complexity. It's sort of something that happens and that you respond to. It's not necessarily something where we hear go, we're really trying to promote feedback loops, positive feedback loops as a strategy. So I suppose one of the things we might have expected when we started this work, you know, when we're talking about what your complex system approach to be, is that complexity language might have been more present. But actually, it seems that colleagues haven't found that as useful. It's been something that people have sort of not engaged with in the same way you have with the rest of the systems language. I suppose that's just sort of a reflection. I don't think that's a good or a bad thing necessarily. Just a reflection that actually people have really followed the systems part, but less so the complexity part, and that's just interesting to us as well. So just really quickly to recap then, those findings. Something really interesting about the different ways you guys are drawing out your systems, how you're defining those systems. Some commonalities in terms of the way you're approaching changing your systems and the need to work in lots of different places all at the same time to make those changes happen. A really optimistic story about the fact that you can change your system even in a difficult context, even in a relatively short amount of time. You can make progress. That's really positive. And often that's about trying to promote the autonomy, the agency of the people within your system so that they can do more themselves. With some final reflections then just around language and how you're thinking and talking about complex systems, different ways of expressing that, different ways of sharing that with your partners and your community, with an emphasis maybe on the systems part and less of an emphasis on the sort of complexity language. I'm going to pause there because I think that's my sort of 20 minutes of just giving you our whistle-stop tour of what might be to come later on. I suppose before we jump into the really exciting session that Rachel's designed for us, if anyone has any reflections or questions on that, please do shout, raise your hand, whichever you're most keen on. Thanks, Liz. Far away.
You know me, I can't bear a silence. It's around your first point, I think, about there's not like a single, was that the first point? Anyway, it's not a single approach that we've taken or a single set of language. And I'm quite heartened by that, because the way I've understood systems approaches is there's lots of different tools you can use, and you don't sort of slavishly follow the whole thing, and you use what suits, and to help you make mental models of what you're trying to sort out, and help you engage with different people depending on your topic and what you're trying to achieve. So I think that's quite reassuring. I think what would be useful for local authorities going forward is maybe some of those tools, but also some principles, so of how to do things. So thinking about cause and effect, thinking about building relationships, thinking about taking in lots of different perspectives and understanding what motivates people, all those, what's going on below the surface that you can't necessarily see, those sorts of things, rather than draw a systems map or draw a system dynamics model or something like that, which I suppose what's Rachel's drawing out with the 10 tips, isn't it? It's not really sort of saying use that approach, but it's just to use the principles, really, just to think. That's all it is. Systems thinking is thinking, isn't it?
Absolutely. In many senses, these systems are very real because they are having impact on all of our lives and the way things work. But the way we draw them up, actually, it's sort of entirely a sort of a construct of how we're working, isn't it? Which is it's really great. I think those are great reflections, Liz. Absolutely. And thank you, because you've broken the dam. You've encouraged some hands, which is perfect. So Tom, you're next on my screen, and then it's Karen and Anne.
Yeah, I'll just sort of come in and back some of that up for Liz as well, really, because obviously we're in the same patch here. Yeah, I mean, we've all kind of been involved in communities and all been involved in local authorities, and where kind of somebody will steam in and try and tell you what you need to do and try and tell you what will be the best way to sort it out, and they're never there very long, and they're never there going to make the great kind of impact, and it never gets any great traction. So hopefully we have given people the opportunity to be part of this for the longer term, and I think people do feel engaged, and I do feel that I've been engaged as a non-local authority person. And it gives me confidence in my relationship with different partners within the local authority as well, because, and I mean, Liz has heard this a number of times, the relationship of me and the organisation I work with Northumberland County Council has been kind of very poor for over 10, 15 years maybe, but as we are working better with them, and there's still, I'll still make my points when I need to, but this is giving us a bit more confidence to be able to work more progressively and more positively with our local authority, because we feel that we're part of it, not kind of being brushed aside by it, if that makes kind of a sense.
I think that absolutely does, Tom. I think a great example of some of the positive achievements that, and I think your story would resonate, I'm sure, in a number of other sites. Karen, I think
Liz might disagree sometimes, but it's fine. It's fine.
No, absolutely, but absolutely, we can't expect perfect harmony. That's not healthy. But Karen, please jump on in.
It was just really on some of that what you said, what you've spoke about, the journey and everything, and the systems thinking and how it looks different as to others. You'll know that within Doncaster Local Authority we have got a number of communities which are regenerative areas that we are really trying to influence, if you like, from the learning from Shaping Stainforth. So actually, we're here with however many local authorities there's quite a lot of us. I mean, some of us are multiple local authorities, so we are within Doncaster one local authority, but in the pockets of communities, the difference for each area, trying to replicate some of the work and share some of the learning is a challenge just within our own, if that's what I'm trying to say. Do you know what I mean? So I think what we've learned and the tools we've gathered along the last couple of years that we've been meeting has been really useful for us to kind of influence some of that thinking. And it's becoming, as we're coming to the end, it's becoming recognised that we have been the driving force in the regenerative work and the positive changes that we've had through the way that we've worked. Like you've said, Josh, some of that just chipping away, juggling more things, just keep going. And I think one of the things that we've had the most success with is bringing residents along that journey with us. And that's what we're trying to kind of change and really get those other communities to recognise. We do it in, you know, from a Well Doncaster perspective, but through the regenerative is actually recognise those residents need to be part of the journey. And we're still on with that, but we keep going.
Absolutely. I like that. I think shaping places for healthier lives, just chipping away could be a bit of a strap line for a lot of this work. The energy and the determination that you all need to keep going and dealing with that. And then sorry, Karen, do you want to jump in?
I just think it's taking any opportunity that comes to you and not being afraid to fail. And you know, one of the hardest things, we're just working with some of our research team aside from you, just to capture some of the ripple effect. And one of the challenges that we've been faced with is thinking about what hasn't worked and actually what didn't work. And we're really struggling to sort of find that, but we're really having to think about what didn't work because we're so fixed on what's been worked well.
Yeah, and great to hear you're using some of those tools in the rest of your work. We won't hold it against you that there are other researchers out there. Fab. And then Emily, and then I'm going to hand over to Rachel because I know there's loads of exciting stuff for the second part of this session. And takes away.
Well, I like just chipping away for sure. I really enjoyed your reflections, Josh. I think that's really really nice to hear it being pulled together like that. And I just had three short things to say. One was I was a bit ambivalent about the systems framing at the outset, and partly I think because there are very few really practical demonstrations about how you make change on the ground, and I think that's part of the contribution of this programme. And I started with a question about how is this different from just good project management? If I was going to run a good project with a local authority, I would do all these things. I would make partnerships. I would, but I think actually coming to the end of it and some of the things that you said, there are differences, and part of that has been around the language and the way we think about it. And I think another thing that has been a bit different is in the use of outsiders. So I think it's been very difficult to do system change without working with people who are slightly outside that system, looking in and saying, well, hang on, I don't understand, or what do you mean that's joined up to that or something? Which is part of the role that we have played in Newham. And the third thing which you mentioned, which is also at the moment the final line in our overall report that we're writing ourselves for the programme, is about the fact that there are no systems, there's just people, and it's relational. And I was watching a Netflix program last night called New Amsterdam. I don't know if anybody's seen that, when a guy goes into a hospital in New York and wants to change the whole system. And in the very first episode, he says, there's only us here. We are the system. So we've got to change us if we're going to change the system. A rubbish program, but anyway, it was... systems thought. So I mean, maybe one of the changes is I'm now even viewing Netflix through the lens of system change. But I think the outsiders and the relational stuff is really important for how it's worked for us. Thank you.
That's really, really helpful, and I'm so sorry that you're so captured by this that you can't even enjoy TV without some complex system content coming in and butting in on your evenings. I apologise for that, but I love that it's springing up all over the place. Emily, the final word goes to you.
Oh, thank you. I love coming last. I also found it really helpful hearing your summary of the programme. I think that really captures the overall programme that we've been working on. So I'm really pleased to hear that. I was thinking about complexity, because you mentioned that at the end, and I think perhaps we haven't talked about complexity. I mean, as a project team, we find it incredibly complex to think about, complex to report on, complex to think about where change is, complex to think about in terms of the action scales model and whether we all have the same understanding of that. And it's just, there's a lot of complexity in it. But in terms of communicating that, we probably don't, because we're focusing on that, simple, hopeful message. And once you start talking about complex, people will completely disengage from what you're saying. So that's probably why we have steered well away from it. So it's not that it isn't complex, but it just isn't helpful to communicate that. I think that's my thought on it.
I think that's really helpful, because I think there's definitely something really important to that about knowing it's there, taking account of it, acknowledging its reality, but actually, is it the means of motivating people? Is it the means of changing things? And once you acknowledge those different pressures, then you start to have different strategies for different audiences and different activities. So I think that's a really great and helpful reflection as well, and a good place to wrap up our sort of looking back portion of the section. Rachel, I apologize, because I think I've gone a little longer than I said I would, but hopefully those were all really exciting comments that are going to warm us up for what you're doing next. So I will, without further ado, just hand over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, definitely helpful, and definitely overlaps between what you've covered just there and everyone's reflections and what we're about to do. So in the next part of this session, we are going to look at some top tips. So what is this? Essentially, we are working on a key program output that will be a summary of top tips to help those interested in working more systemically, to kind of have a head start, really. So think about it in terms of, what would you have really liked to know at the beginning of your work? And the primary audience will be councils, but there's no reason it can't apply more broadly. So, as Josh was saying, there's no one way of taking a systems approach, but as Liz was saying, what are the common principles that sit underneath that? So this top tips output will sit alongside the learning and research outputs, and they very much complement one another, but possibly hit a slightly different audience. So the top tips should be more of a summary in very plain, kind of jargon-free language that will possibly reach some people who may not dig into a full report, and then the report will be there for those who do want to dig into that detail, which is great. So to create a set of draft top tips, which I shared, I think most of you have had a look over email, I have reviewed monthly check-in content, learning and research reports, and other notes, but I've deliberately not pulled all of that detail into this board yet, because I think sometimes doing that then stops people being open with their thoughts and their additions. So I wanted to have this session allowing you to create the space to bring what you want to the table. And then afterwards, I'll go back through all of that existing content and notes that we have and plug any gaps or kind of bolster what is said today through all of those notes. And then what we'll end up with is a set of up to 10 tips. We've currently got 8, and each of them will have a headline, detail that sits underneath that headline of how to apply that tip in practice, and then a mini case study. So imagine like a call out kind of pop-up thing that puts a bit of colour to the tip by showcasing a kind of mini case study of that tip from one of your projects. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to put the link in the chat. I will share my screen as well, but if you want to open up the Miro board as well, you can. And we are going to run through the tips and give you the chance to add in. So I'm going to share my screen now just so I can give you a bit of an overview of the board. Hopefully you can see that. So what we've got, I'm just zoomed out at the moment, but you can see the 8 tips here. And in each tip, we've got a section in yellow post-its for practical advice, specific examples of how you put this tip into practice, or kind of resources or tools that we might want to add that will help other people put this into practice. Then in the red post-its, we've got any feedback on the tip itself. So for example, ooh, boundary is a bit of a jargony word. Can we change that language? And then in green is a place where you can put your name or your site name if you think you have an example that we can put in one of those little mini case study banners on that particular tip. And then all the way to the right here, there's a space for anything key that's missing that is not featured across any of the tips. So if you think there's a big gap that we're not covering, then jot it here. So what we're going to do, Ella and I are going to sort of alternate going through each tip. We're going to focus on the yellow post-it notes and have conversation about that. And then I'll ask you just to add to the red and the green post-its yourselves as we go, because yeah, we have enough time, but limited time that we can't go through absolutely everything. So if you don't mind, as we go, feel free to just add to the red and the green post-its, and we'll focus on the yellow ones. So I'm just going to do a very quick high-level run through of all of the 8 tips, so you can just have them all laid out for you before we start digging into them. Does anyone have any questions before I do that? No, okay. So tip number 1 is understand your system and agree a realistic scope or system boundary from the outset. That's about kind of implies going through a bit of a mapping process or taking the chance at the outset of a project to step back and think about the system as a whole. The boundary bit is the bit that I kind of want to focus on in this tip, which is just at the early stages, being aware that you cannot do everything. So what is the scope or boundary of your work? What are the constraints that either are put in place for you or that you actively put in place to frame your work so that you have a bit more focus? So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, develop a clear vision that everyone can rally behind. When I looked across the notes, there was actually quite a lot in there about the importance of having that vision piece almost as a way of engaging stakeholders and bringing them together early on, and also as something that sort of sets a stake in the ground about the direction of travel, the direction you want to go in. That's tip number 2. Tip number 3, possibly like the main one of this whole program, take time to build relationships across all levels of the system. So you won't be surprised to see this here. This is just about the vital element of systems change work, which is relationship building and taking time to do it, and being aware that it can take time, it can be slow, but for people to know at the outset of systems change work that this is the work. It's not an optional extra. This is the piece of the puzzle that really lays the foundation for everything that follows. Tip 4, design for legacy from the beginning. We can probably frame that in a more accessible way, but essentially, how can you think about cutting yourselves out of the picture as a project team from the beginning? Now, not everyone reading these tips might have a kind of formalized project in the way that we have, but whatever shape the work takes, how can you think about what comes next, what comes after it, and really think about that proactively from the outset? And then tip 5, challenge traditional power dynamics. Originally, I thought this could sit as part of relationship building, but actually I think it warrants being called out separately, because changing the resource flows of a system and thinking about decision making and funding as a way of subverting traditional power dynamics is a key part of systems change, and I think is something that a lot of you have faced and thought about over the course of your projects. Tip number 6, take time to step back and reflect. To Anne's point, I do think this is one of those things where, is it systemic? Is it just good project working. But I do think a key part of systems thinking and systems change is recognizing that not everything is delivery and that you need to slow down in order to then speed up. So that one is in there for that reason. Tip 7, build on what already exists. Again, kind of could be seen as straightforward, but I think in particular for systems change, this is important to call out, because I think when you think about systemic change and systemic work, you think huge, big, meaty projects, big things that we're delivering and kind of ego-driven pieces of work, when actually some of the most substantial changes can just be from piggybacking on what's already out there and putting a slight different slant on it, or building on a policy that already exists. And then finally, tip number 8, focus on messages of hope when telling your story. So I think it's really important to have something in here about the influencing piece, which is largely done through storytelling in whatever shape or form. And I feel like a big learning for a lot of you was just, even in times of crisis, focusing on things that are really hard in your system, coming from a point of hope and the strengths is transformative. So that is in there too. So those are the 8 tips that we've got so far. Open to feedback and change. They're not fixed at this point, which is why we're doing this now. So do add to the bit on the box on the right over here if there's key things that you think are missing, but they might come out as we go through this. So any questions on that before we kind of go into each tip one by one and open up for thoughts? Does what we're doing make sense? Claire?
Thanks, Rachel. It was just a quick question. When you've got examples in practice, how does that differ to the case studies that you're asking for?
It doesn't. I think
okay.
I think an example in practice was more just to give you a suggestion of what a case study might be. But when it comes to formulating these tips, I think what it will likely be is kind of a headline tip, a subheading that gives a bit more context to what that tip is, and then how to take this forward. So key tips or advice for taking it forward, and then a call out banner that gives a more specific worked example of how that lands in practice. But the examples in practice, I think, would just have one of them essentially per tip, I think, at this point.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah,
that's right. Anne?
I'm not sure, Rachel, whether you think this is in there somewhere, but one of the things that I found a bit challenging sometimes is getting bogged down in the system stuff and the process and losing track of the point of all of it. And so despite the fact this being a system process, it's no different from everything else, where you have to have your sense of the output we are aiming for, and keeping it practical. And I think somebody perhaps Liz said earlier, in terms of explaining this to people, emphasizing complexity is a bit of a turn off, but emphasizing how something's going to work is definitely what everybody wants to know. They all want to know, that's fine, but what are the 3 things I've got to do tomorrow to make a difference, is a sort of phrase that we get the whole time. So I don't know where that goes. Yes, maybe it's in the step back and reflect, but it's also in the keeping everything focused on the goal, really, and not getting lost in the woods of system discussion unless it's really practical and helps.
Yeah. To me, I mean, it's easy, I think, to post-rationalize and fit everything into these 8 tips that I'm trying to not be attached to. But I think for me, what you're saying would fit into both this first point about having that boundary, like setting out from the outset that you can't do everything, and then also the take time to step back and reflect. So it doesn't have to be about returning to your systems map, but it's returning to that bigger picture and coming back to your vision, and kind of clearing out some of the noise periodically, I would say. Emily?
Thanks. Just following on from what Anne was saying, when I read through the tips, for quite a lot of them, I wanted to put something in about communication. And I just wondered if communication itself should be its own tip, because quite a lot of this is about how do you communicate things that are really complex in a way that's really appealing to people. And that focus, the specific tip in here is about your storytelling. But that's only part of the communication, because we're also communicating our call to action. We're also communicating local information. For us, it was about debunking myths, all that kind of thing that people have, people believe all sorts of things, but you're trying to reframe the issue, and not just that we can make a difference, but that you in your role can do something. So there's a whole thing around the language we're using and how we engage with people, and it also comes into the systems mapping. You might do really complicated systems mapping, but for us that hasn't been an appropriate thing to communicate. We've had to really simplify that mapping to make it really easily digestible and to move people onto the action bit, which is the bit that people really enjoy and want to be part of.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think it might be that the storytelling tip changes and evolves to fit in more of that overall communication element. But if it needs to be separate, that's fine. I would say for now, anything you're thinking that could fit into that tip, bring it up when we talk about the storytelling one. And then if we feel like it needs to be separated out, then we can do that, but just make sure to raise it in conversation. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off on tip 1 then, just because we have approximately 7 to 8 minutes per tip and we want to have a break as well. So we shall get started. I will set a timer for this one for 8 minutes and see how we go. Okay, so tip 1, as we've said, understand your system and agree a realistic scope or system boundary from the outset. So we learned through the program that just because you're doing systems change work, it doesn't mean that you have to influence multiple areas at once. You can focus on a smaller geographic area, or you can focus on a clear kind of topic area and then expand outwards from there. So as Aaron mentioned earlier, focusing on a hyperlocal area like Stainforth, but then enabling that to be used to influence other local areas to change and do the same. I think we've realised through this programme that taking on too much too quickly because you feel like it needs to be systemic actually can sometimes slow things down rather than speed things up in terms of change. So a couple of examples I think some people have added. Newham suggesting creating subsystem maps on specific areas of your overall complex system. And this one here, stressing the importance of developing the map with others with different perspectives. So specifically bringing in other perspectives into the conversation, using that as a communication tool, but also to help set the system boundary. There's other points, I'm not going to read them all out. But when you think about that tip of understanding your system and agreeing a realistic scope or boundary, what would you add to help people really do that and put that into practice? Liz?
Should we provide some examples so people can, because it's obviously a visual process, isn't it? So, because there's lots of types of systems maps and some are really complicated if you want to understand cause and effect. Some can just be really quite simple, like who's out there, what do they think, who could you influence. So there's some are just to help you make sense of like your brain when it's all foggy and you only use it yourself. And some of that sometimes it's more that you do it with others, so you get a shared understanding of your system and your boundaries. So I just wondered if there's not one that we would advocate, but it's again like there's different approaches you could try and pick which one suits your context.
Yeah, and I should say as well, for each of the tips where relevant and where we have it, we might add a couple of links to further resources. So it's not to promote one specific mapping tool, but to give people a head start in this is something that might be useful. So yeah, definitely. I suppose a question would be, if someone was starting out on a systems change project like you did initially, and they said to you, how do I decide where to focus my resource and my effort on this project? What would you say to them to help them make that decision?
Do a system map.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't
Why?
that what they're for? To help you?
Yeah.
That was the whole point. Was you did a system map so that you could spot the levers in the system and you knew where to take action.
Yeah. So specifically using the systems map as a way of getting a sense of the area and working out where you're going to then intervene.
And there can't be any point in doing it unless you do that with it.
Yeah.
Apart from, as I've just put in the chat, which seems to be increasing the case in academic papers, which is to show the system map and then say, you won't be able to figure this out. I'm just showing you how complex the system is. That seems to be the main use of them in sort of public communication. But if within the team, they should be useful for spotting links between domains that perhaps you hadn't thought were linked before, or, you know, adding extra causes that weren't there in the normal way people were talking about it.
Mm. And then how do you get to that next step then? How do you determine your angle or your focus within that broad map that you've created?
Well, in our case in Newham, and what we did in the end was pick two areas of the map that we then did more mapping in. So we had subsystems, two subsystems. One of my other top tips would be get a systems mapping person involved. It's not something that it's easy to do as an amateur, and so people who understand the software and how to draw the links and so on. Others, you can spend hours and hours on that kind of stuff. And it was a case of well, it was teamwork. It was getting everybody around the table and saying, okay, we've got this huge picture now, what do we do? And the people actually in practice on the ground going, well, I can see a way. The other thing was that these were domains that it was clear to us that the council had some authority over. So there was no point in us picking a bit of the map that the local authority was never going to be able to change. You know, we would have liked to have got rid of or done something about town planning in terms of the shops and businesses. That was not within actually the remit of public health, despite the fact that it ought to be and they would like it to be. But there's something to do about that.
That's thinking about what you actually have the ability to influence and control as much as anything. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, Claire and Liz, coming to you, and then it'll probably be time to move on. That's how quick 8 minutes goes. Claire.
Oh, just to say, in terms of sort of choosing geographical areas, two things in that I think this was done before our time in the application, using lots of different available data, indices of deprivation and food security, cost of living, all that kind of thing. But we didn't have a rationale. And when we came into post, it was one of the first things people were asking us, why have you chosen these areas and not these areas? And because there was no rationale about how they made that decision, it was difficult to justify, and we had to actually go back and find the person who'd moved on to another job, who'd written the application, to find out. So yeah, that's another thing that needs to be considered.
Yeah. Thanks, Claire. Elle is busy writing all of this down, by the way. And then finally, Liz.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. One is just your those of you who are involved in the discovery phase. Some of the webinars talked about that, mapping it across that spheres of influence model, and we found that we did that a little bit. Just we tried lots of different ways of doing it, and what the ones that made sense is the one we continued with. And then where to influence was more about where could you see quite a few sort of clusters happening that was like a bit of a central point, and maybe that was somewhere where you would try and influence. So rather than right on the edge with only one effect and one cause, maybe not, but maybe something a bit more in the middle when you've got lots of influences coming in and out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Liz. Okay, so we're basically at time. We'll move on to the next one, but just to say, keep finishing off the notes that you're adding there in yellow, and please do, if you have any feedback on how best to frame this tip or how to put it across in a way that helps make it accessible, then please add that below. And similarly, if you would be happy to provide a quote or something for this tip to help make it more evident to people how it actually works in practice. Elle, do you want me to carry on sharing my screen while you talk about the next one?
Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about well, yeah, you leave it up. I've got the screen in front of me here as well, a little bit bigger. The other thing I was going to say is obviously Rachel and I are adding in what you're commenting right now, but obviously we're going to share this board, or you can continue to contribute to this board after the session. So please look through kind of anything that we've put your name next to, as we want to make sure that what you've said is recorded accurately, basically. Right, should we start on the second tip then? So tip number 2 is develop a clear vision that everyone can rally behind. So obviously this is all about getting key stakeholders and anyone involved aligned around what you're trying to achieve, and making this vision visual if possible, so that you can return to it as your inspiring Northern Star. So I can see people have added a few bits around kind of advice and how to do this. So Karen, you've said ensure stakeholders get something out of it, which is a really good point. You've also said to take residents on the journey with you. In Newham, you've added a couple of points around ensuring that your communication takes place within already established communication channels, which I think is really, really key. And then BNSSG you've added to make sure that you engage with the diversity of the community. Sorry, that's a bit small. And ensure you continue to get support from local partners and ensure their ideas are included, for example, in the action plan development. Does anyone have those are really good pieces of advice. Does anyone have any kind of more specific examples of how to exactly go about doing that, or how you've gone about doing that? Liz, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I've just reflected on quite often in a council we're guilty of just going out with the vision and saying what do you think, and you can tweak the odd word, but basically very little ability to influence. But in the discovery phase, we did that as in a workshop session. We did a bit with Theo, and then to learn how to do it, and then we did it in a workshop session with all our stakeholders during COVID. So that's how we came up with our vision.
Okay, and so that was the design council session then. So yeah. Specific tools that we could add in relation to that session that you did.
Yeah, so it was my reports session. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Has anyone else got any other ideas around more specifically how to, or things that you found helpful when kind of developing your vision? Karen? Oh, sorry, Kate. Sorry, I just saw the initials. Kate.
Hi, so I'm trying to put my hand down and put my video back on. I've just made a comment really, and it's sort of around the vision. So we had a visual vision, which one helps to communicate kind of the aims of the programme, but what we've also done is use the same vision to sort of document our activities along the way. So it doesn't just sort of sell where we'd like to be in 10 years' time, but it also kind of gives some suggestions about how we might get there or what we've been doing to get there. So I just sort of put that, it's quite a useful tool to use in that call to action as well. So, this is where we want to be in 10 years' time. These are the levers and these are the actions that we can all take to get us there. So I think I've popped it in one of the bottom boxes.
Yeah, I can see that.
I'd share it as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember talking about this with, I think, Emily, you used that in a session, didn't you, with stakeholders at one point? Do you want to come in? You've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, we use our vision all the time. And I think that's something about this tip Because like when I think about when we created the vision, that was in the discovery phase, which feels like a million years ago. And like Northumbria, we did that in a session with partners all online because it was all COVID safe times. But it's how we use that vision. We show our visual vision in every meeting. We have it in every report. We then use that to refer back to. It's selling the hope. It's also measuring change. So, you need to use that vision in lots of ways. And in itself, it's a tool of systems change. So I think maybe the tip, creating the vision or developing the vision isn't quite the right framing. It needs to be more about how you use that vision throughout.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yes, it's almost become a part of your kind of branding, I suppose, around what you're doing. That's a really interesting point. Okay, so there we'll note down then possibly kind of a changing of language around how we describe this specific tip. Was there anything else that people wanted to add, or any other tools that you found helpful? Karen?
I don't know how you put it into words really, but do you know, like when you think about a vision, and I know we wrote a vision, we talked in Doncaster a lot about long timeism and that vision for the future and everything, but actually when we've got something, I know we've got other projects and developments that are happening alongside us in Stainforth. I'm thinking about the unity and how we've used that as a visual vision, if that makes sense, to really they've been supportive of us on the journey and use them. We've kind of supported them in their progress and they've supported us, if that makes sense. So it's working with other partners to make that vision happen, if that makes sense.
Like joining the dots between kind of where your vision and their vision overlaps, and then kind of working together to kind of push that message across.
So I think that's like having it's a shared outcome, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? We've got a shared vision there and actually working together. So and I think having the vision, being visual as well and being able to see it has been really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
In terms of the actual visual, do you have any advice or thoughts on how best to create something that people want to look at and want to come back to?
No, I think I can only speak for us with the photographs that we've had. So we've been very conscious at creating an archive of photographs. So there's a visual vision of it developing and everything. So and we've shared it a lot and talked about it a lot. And also we used residents to share and showcase and by using their own visual social media and things. So really using residents to capture it, I think.
Okay, so that involvement from the residents from early stages. Emily, this will probably be the last time, what point we have time for.
I hope it will only be brief. Just in terms of that visual, for us, it was really important that it was geographically local. So our visual is based on the Shropshire Hills, which is the kind of key feature of South Shropshire, and everyone who lives there, there's a sense of belonging in that. So it's important to incorporate.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Yeah, that sense of belonging. And that kind of feels like almost obvious, but actually it's important to state the obvious with things like this. Fab, thank you very much, everyone. That's really helpful. Hopefully we've got that all down. Rachel, shall I hand over to you now to go on to the next one?
How is everyone? Do people want to do one more and then have a break, or have a quick break now?
One more, and then I just saw
one more.
A couple of fingers up.
I need a break. One more. Everyone happy to do one more?
Yeah, one more. Sorry, I'm on mute.
Okay, one more. We'll do one more and then we'll have a break. All right. So start my timer. So the next tip number 3, is take time to build relationships across all levels of the system. So I feel like if there's been one common principle across all projects, it's probably this. Relationship building is work. Relationships are the system. So take time to do this properly before rushing into decisions. I think we've found that investing time in building relationships from right the way from community organisations through to senior stakeholders in the system then gives you the leverage to act later on. So a couple of points that have already been added. Well, there was this one about when engaging and when developing relationships, think about the language you use in order to best engage people. Originally, this was a separate tip, but then I wondered whether it could just inform part of how your relationship build. So there's that. Then what else have we got? Newham echoing the fact that systems are made up of people, that it's all relational at the end of the day. And Karen here saying that investing and believing in local people creates trust and opportunities. So essentially by building those relationships, you're working kind of symbiotically with the rest of the system. So does anyone else, lots of people busy typing away already. Does anyone want to add anything to this? How do you go about building those relationships? What might we say through this tip to give people the confidence that relationship building is kind of vital work, and how can they go about it? Anne.
I'm not sure. Just reflecting whether I'm answering your question there. But what I was thinking when you first started presenting this is also you have to give something back. So finding what you can do that helps them. So what we've done with the intervention has really been free bonus for people for the schools that Jenny's working in and so on. So articulating how you can help people achieve what their ends are helps build the relationship.
Yeah, so not seeing it as just what does the council want to achieve and how are you going to use people to do that, but actually engaging in relationship building to understand what is needed in the system, and then
and at the basic level, just to offer something back.
Yeah.
Help.
Yeah. What else? How did you make a start on building relationships? How would you prioritize who to speak to? How would you carve out time for it? How would you go about it in a way that helps?
I know what Andy would say, which is food. So we gave people the fantastic local food in Newham. There were a lot of samosas, and also Andy used to work in importing coffee, so he's very, very keen on giving people extremely good coffee.
Go on, Karen.
I think exactly the same. It's about getting people to being present in the community. I know it's different for different people. It depends what areas they cover, but certainly for us, it's people knowing who you are, saying if you're going to do something to do it, and just being present there. And food's always a good lever into to get people there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got quite a lot to say on this. The other thing that we found very useful is the young people. So people will come and talk to us and build relationships if they believe that we have the ear of, that we listen to young people, and that the young people are woven into the project. That will obviously vary depending on who your key, who you were aiming at. But ours, it was 11 to 19-year-olds, and making sure that their voice was heard was essential to getting the project right, but it was also really essential to building trust with other people at all sorts of levels.
Mm-hmm.
Anne, can I just ask on that then? What did you do? Because there's one thing to say, oh yeah, how did you make them feel that their voice would be heard? Was there anything immediately that you did that?
We give them a platform. So there were young people at all our events. They spoke. We had relationships with organisations that represented young people back. So making sure that the young people are actually there. We're publishing a separate engagement report on all the work that we did with young people. As we know from previous experience, people will want that, even if they're not interested in the topic that we're talking about. They just want to hear young people's voices. So it's a very useful tool, as well as being critical, it is a useful tool for engagement. And what else did we do? Well, we went to where the young people were. So we went to the youth centres and to schools and had groups and spoke to them. And I'm sure everybody else has done very similar kinds of engagement work with the community. But, making sure that people know you've done that and finding ways of communicating it and showcasing it is really important and builds relationships.
And in a practical sense, how do you not just kick off a relationship, but keep it going? How would you advise people to best do that?
Well, if that's come back at me, I think you tell them what you've done with it. So it's helping people to understand how they contributed and how important they were by sharing the results, sharing the celebration, sharing the outputs, pointing out you said this, and so we built that into the project.
Yeah. And then slightly different angle, Claire, I know that in BNSSG there was a lot of effort and work to build relationships and set them up. How would you motivate other people to keep going even when it feels hard?
Oh, that's tricky. I think one thing that helped, particularly Laura, because she was working in areas where she wasn't working for that council and she wasn't from those community organisations, she was seen as kind of like a neutral person, and but therefore she was like trusted, and that really helped her to like negotiate those relationships when they became tricky. And yeah, definitely that was good. Not sure.
That's helpful.
On the spot there.
That's helpful. Any final comment on relationship building and how to do it? Everyone's
just
ready for
gonna-
a cup of tea. Go on, Liz.
one of our storytelling slides that we did, that we got help from the designer to do, has got a diagram about relational engagement and what's the difference between, so I put it there at the bottom, episodic engagement and relational, so that more longer term two-way, rather than which councils usually do, which is like very one-off, and then you don't take time to go back and build on what you've done before. It's all very lots of short-term consultations. So it's a heartbeat for, that's the idea behind it.
That's helpful, thank you. Yeah, and comes back to what Anne was saying at the beginning. It's not just a one-off transaction, but how do you keep it going and what do you give back? All right, that's us. We'll have a break and then we will come back together to do the remaining tips. So let's say 25 past, not 5 minutes, not quite 10. Is that all right? Okay, see you 25 past.
Good.
Right, I think because we're a bit squashed for time, we're going to have to crack straight on. So people will join as they join, I guess. Right, Elle, are you doing this one? And should we do super speed 6 minutes per remaining?
I think I'll do less speaking and more listening from you guys. So yeah, tip number 4, designing for legacy from the beginning. So the sustainability of all of your work. So thinking about what will happen once the funded program is over, or once the project is over, what will kind of outlive your specific input on the program. So a couple of points have been added. So I think there's a really good point from BNSSG around trying to not use the word project from the offset and using words like initiative instead, which imply kind of a longer term piece of work or longer term impact. From Shropshire, thinking about who's able to take forward your plans after you've moved on. Aiming to change the structures within the system. So for example, promoting new posts, kind of new job roles and posts that will take work forward afterwards. Those are a few things that you've added already. Are there any other thoughts that you have that you'd like to add? So obviously this point came about from it's being built into the programme, but obviously one of the kind of key bits of feedback we got around the Designing for Legacy webinar series was that series would have been really helpful to have had at the beginning of the programme. Are there any other things that you kind of wish that you had known or thought about at the beginning of the programme? Claire?
I'm not sure if you've got this in there somewhere already, but designing for legacy. So thinking about it right from the start. How will this last beyond our work when our posts have gone? And how can we make it sustainable?
So really allocating time right at the start to think about almost like the end, I suppose, or kind of.
Yeah, and having those conversations with people, you know, when they're applying for funding for initiatives and things, having those conversations about what will happen, you know, in a year's time when this funding stops, and what are your
kind of
thoughts
not to be
about
scared
that?
to ask the questions of, and kind of state the obvious, that this isn't going to go on, this funding or whatever it is can't go on forever, rather than shying away from that, actually addressing it quite early on. Yeah. Anne?
Again, I think it's one that makes me think, what is specific about systems stuff here? Because I would want to build legacy into all the work that we do. And one of the main ways that I do that is through publications, through making sure that the piece is findable. If somebody wants to know about this in 5 years' time, it will exist on the web. There will be, you know, a referee journal article somewhere. There'll be things like that, so that it gives it a credibility and a life. But that's got nothing to do with systems thinking. So if this is system specific, then it's more what are the changes in the system that you have to make, which is why the point that we put up there was about the posts in the system. So I think when this is being written up, it's if it's system specific, some of this stuff is, I think, just what you should be doing, you know, what we would be doing anyway in a project if we wanted it to live.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction to make. Thank you. Liz?
So the other thing that you can leave behind, as well as trying to change policies and procedures and behaviours, it is about behaviours. So how's knowledge and skills increased in the people you've been working with over the project? So we've just done a survey, which is not closed yet. So we've had about 50 responses so far, but knowledge of asset basing has increased quite significantly amongst the people who filled in the survey. So 60% said they felt they knew more about asset-based approaches, and 60% said they put them into practice as well. So that's a good way of thinking about the legacy of your project as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. Karen.
No, it don't matter because what I was going to say was probably not meet this, so it's all right.
Please say it anyway, though, because I think
it's
this isn't set in stone. Yeah.
We talk about systems thinking a lot, and in these sessions we've revisited the whole wording around and some of the language around systems thinking, and it's I think some of the advice and sort of that practical thinking is around the language and actually what does systems thinking mean to each side, if that makes sense, because it's been we kind of overthought the whole idea of systems change and that, rather than use simpler language.
Okay, so language as a point of like sustainability in itself, and I think language is something that we didn't give it a specific individual tip because we felt that it kind of would be woven into kind of various different elements of this piece. But yeah, in terms of sustainability, then important that people actually understand it. Yeah. I think we're probably up for time on this one. Obviously continue to add things if you've got more to say on it. Rachel, I'll give it to you.
We'll move on, but do keep adding, and also please do, I think you have been, but please do add to the red and green post-its for the tips as well. That would be great. Moving on to tip number 5, which means we are now over halfway. So tip 5 is challenge traditional power dynamics. Oh, I need to stop my timer. So challenge traditional power dynamics. This is about the fact that, resources in traditional systems tend to flow in a certain way. And I guess as part of working systemically or trying to change it, as part of trying to change a system, you've all come up against this need to change how you work and to work more systemically in order to change the system almost as you go, implicitly as well as explicitly. Typically those at the top call the shots, and a number of you through your projects have either brought youth voice or resident voice into decision making to challenge this, or have used micro grants as a way of literally handing power over to people in the system who might not have it. So yeah, what would you say to this? How would you help people starting out on this journey to challenge traditional power dynamics in order to better change their systems? And some things we've got so far on here are around, kind of what I just said, providing funding direct to the community as a way of reversing typical power dynamics so that people in communities have funding that they can decide what to do with themselves, or challenging how decisions are made, so bringing residents onto boards, that kind of thing. Yeah. Is there anything else to add about how to do this, how to challenge power? Karen?
I think there's something around bold leadership and being brave and just being able to take the risk and being allowed to take the risk. I think that is one of the key sort of factors in, because it's doing things a little bit differently. So
yeah. So the fact that because you're in this kind of explicitly named systems change project, you almost had license to experiment a bit with how you worked and bringing in apprentices and things like that.
Yeah. I think having that little bit, that flexible sort of income to be able to allow us to do it, because I think in the other areas that's what's missing. So having some access to funds to be able to do it is being a is a really good driver in it, if you like, because we've been fortunate in that, and that's the way we've been able to really test and learn. So
yeah. Anyone else? Emily?
I just wanted to say, I think sharing information is a really powerful part of this as well, about changing power dynamics. It's not just about giving agency to people, it's giving them information and making sure those information flows are flowing much more easily.
Why is that important?
Well, for us in Shropshire, it's been important because people have so much misinformation. So if you provide them with information that you have access to, that gives them the information they need to really think about the issues, engage with them in a different way, and have that real evidence base.
Yeah. Any other points on this one? Great.
Hi, sorry. I've just popped it on one of the post-its, but I think, I mean, we've talked in the past about finding people who can advocate for the projects, and I think for us it's kind of, I've put allies in inverted commas, but I think it's about finding people who are sort of on the same page already and sort of banding together so the voice becomes stronger, and sort of that, again, bringing people along on that journey, and to sort of challenge where the power, you know, that where the power lies, and then sort of you're kind of creating your own little pockets of, you know, people who are thinking the same as you.
In order to then be able to influence together rather than separately.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a collective voice as opposed to, yeah, just a couple of lone voices.
Yeah. Great. And any advice, I guess, more practical advice for, other than, you know, having funding, which is nice, but some people might not have that. What can you do to challenge power in a maybe softer way as well? You might be saved by the bell on that one, to be honest. Yeah.
That's fine. Should we move on to the next one? People can continue to add. Oh, Karen, do you want to come in quickly?
No, it was just really like we've talked about, chipping away. I think it's recognizing what's in your gift and going down the specific channels and the meetings, and really keep promoting and giving examples where things have worked. And I think in that way you can only just use your own experiences of the case studies and the positives to hope that it shapes the things.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so we'll move on to tip 6, which is all about stepping back and reflecting. And so obviously we know that nothing's going to change overnight. Nothing's going to suddenly drastically change. And that kind of the difference, I suppose, is that traditional projects can sometimes be quite tunnel visioned and focus, as Rachel said earlier, on just pure delivery. Whereas what we've tried to do on this programme, I guess, is allowing people to have the space to be able to step back and reflect a little bit more. So yeah, your advice around being able to actually put this into practice. So Claire has put in to build in reflection from the start of the project, including learning in evaluation plans. Newham have said involve inside and outside partners in the work. Outsiders have interesting new perspectives. Also a comment on having fortnightly team meetings to keep conversations going. What other ways have you, or kind of in addition to those bits, have you been able to kind of implement a more reflective approach with this work? Kind of really practical steps that you've taken as teams. Could be anything really simple, I suppose. in terms of even just like in your team meetings, I suppose, does anyone kind of allocate a specific time to really actually just reflect? Emily?
Yeah, we do in Shropshire, and I think it's because we work for different organisations and we don't have access to exactly the same systems. So we've had to set up a system. So we have our Miro board, and sort of each month we have a new space on the Miro board, where we can put our reflections, because there are so many things that change over a month. It's quite easy to forget things, so just having that space and then coming together to talk about it is really important for us, and then that helps us to identify kind of follow-up actions and things that we, places where we could place our energy. So that's been how we've done it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about being able to stop, just so that you can actually then identify where to go next, I suppose. Karen?
I think we reflect quite often in Stainforth. We like, I present at ward members meetings, the sort of updates, and that gives us a chance to reflect on the last meetings, because they always pull up what we did last time, and I have actions from them. And that are within the local authority, we have various bronze and silver strategic, so I update there, and again they take notes and then read it back. So that's a time for reflecting. But then I think one of the biggest reflection tools that we have, which is when we first started, we had somebody visually draw some of the conversations that we had, and actually those pictures are brought out regularly at our community meetings, where we look back and then capture, actually it shows what we have done, what they wanted, and this is how far we've come. And again, like everybody else has said, we have with the team weekly team meetings where we do look back and reflect, and then we use internal within council partners Teams channels, which we've got up, which allows people to sort of contribute internally to what we're to some of the plans that we've got as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
What are good questions to ask yourselves?
What sorry, good.
What are good questions, or what questions would you recommend that people ask to help themselves reflect?
Gosh, we always work in a way like and frame it in a proper strength based, or in signs of safety sort of words. What worked well, what you're worried about, and next steps. What worked well, what you're worried about, and what happens next. So we that's how we structure our kind of questioning and thinking when we're meeting to reflect. I don't know what else. The questions.
In terms of tools, then obviously Emily's mentioned Miro. Does anyone else use kind of other specific tools? No. What about kind of the hard, what do people find it hard to actually create the space to reflect? Do you find that you get too sucked into, as it says above, delivery? Or does it come quite naturally to have these pauses?
For us, I think they just, for me, particularly in Doncaster, they are not conscious reflection points, if you like. They are like in the meetings I go to, it's just what they do is look back over the past month, see if there's any progress. So I think they're just natural. I think it is, like I mentioned, we're doing the mapping of the impact of some of the connections that we've made, and it's really difficult to reflect on quite negative things and stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's hard. It's always easier to reflect on the things that went well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Rachel, I'll hand back over to you.
Yeah, Thank you. All right, penultimate tip, moving straight on. I shall start the timer, is to build on what already exists. So this is about removing the ego from the outset, thinking about collaboration. So understanding that as a project team or as a piece of work, you are only one part of the system, and accepting this from the beginning. So building on the assets, the relationships, and the foundations of change that are already there. So how might you go about doing this? How might you build on what already exists? Liz from Heart Blythe says, you don't know what you need until you know what you have. Focus on the strengths and assets in the system, and others are more likely to want to get involved. Kate has said, don't presume that others in the system know what already exists. So I think that comes back a bit to the information sharing point. So convene and communicate as a way of not just building on what exists, but telling other people what already exists. Yeah. Anyone have anything to add to that? How can you help people to understand how they might build on what already exists? Claire.
I put it on the board, but it thought it was worth raising here as well. Flexibility is was really important for us. So it looked differently in all our 5 areas, both the structure of the group that we got together, how many people shared the funding, and what initiatives we did, depending on what was already going on there, what networks they already had. So yeah, that having that ability to respond to what we found and what people said they wanted was key.
Yeah, thank you. Tom.
Yeah, hi all. I'm sorry I've missed a bit of the that middle chunk there, sorry. But it was just a kind of almost like a little step back in it. When we talk about other platforms and other kind of stuff, we're doing some work with community groups at the moment on something called Canva, which allows whiteboards, but it also allows sort of presentations and a number of other bits. I'll put a link in the in the chat for anybody who is interested in following that. But we're going to be doing that more over the next couple of months. But we will be engaging with a lot of the groups and organisations who have been involved in the Heart of Blythe programme locally. Sorry, catching up a little bit there. Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Emily.
I think there's something here about change. So if I think back to what existed back in 2021, it's quite different to what exists in 2024. And if I think about community groups and activities that are happening, it's in a constant state of flux. So it's not just building on what already exists, but it's keeping track of what exists and those changes so that you can effectively tell people, when things are starting, when they're stopping, what opportunities there are. So on our Miro board, we have like it's in a quadrants, but one of the quadrants is opportunities, and that's quite often we put where there's been changes.
So how would you frame this tip, do you think?
Well, I suppose it's build on what already exists, and then maybe you just need to extend it into a longer sentence. All the detail goes in the box below, but it is about keeping on top of what the changes that are happening and looking out for those opportunities.
Yeah. Okay. Anne.
Well, I realise that I've misunderstood the tip somehow. Because to start off with, I was slightly perplexed by the question, because I'm thinking, but what exists is a system. So that's what we were building on. That's what we wanted to do, was to change what already existed and build on it. So I didn't entirely understand that bit of it. And then the academic in me always thinks, well, of course I build on what exists, because there's a literature base out there. People have done this kind of work. They've tried to reduce food insecurity in this age group before. So we build on what's there before, but also extend it and do what wasn't done before. So, a big part of what we're doing in Newham is that out of school food insecurity in out of school settings, there is no basis there. There's nothing in the system already. Those were the gaps the system mapping showed up. There are no policies in that context. Nobody's doing work there, and there isn't a research literature. And so in that sense, I am building on what does not exist. So I've not really I'm struggling to think how to answer this question, because this isn't really how I come at it.
That's helpful though, because I think being aware of how it might be misinterpreted means that it needs to be phrased differently. For me, it was about not simply creating something new for the sake of creating something new, essentially, and thinking about how you can leverage what's already out there to get further quicker. But you're also right in the second part of what you're saying about how if your system's map showcases a gap, it might make more sense to plug that gap rather than to focus your efforts on a part of the system that is already working as you might want it to. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Emily, final point from you, and then we'll move to the final tip.
Can you just reframe it around building on local assets, so that it's clear that it is about those kind of local things that are happening?
Yeah, I think that makes more sense. Yeah, awesome. All right, let's move on to the last one, and I'll pass back to you, Elle, and then we'll have just a couple minutes at the end to wrap up.
Great, thank you. So final tip is focusing on messages of hope when telling your story. And I mean, this has cropped up many times through our conversations, especially kind of with the context that we've all been working in over the past few years. So kind of there's been lots of talk around kind of reactive emergency working versus kind of longer term working, and being able to focus on kind of the positive things that are happening and the change that is possible to be made. So a couple of points that people have added in here already. This was from Louise Marshall actually, but avoiding fatalism so you don't scare people away. I think that's really important. People need to feel that things are achievable. Supporting people to feel empowered and feel like they have a role to play rather than it being somebody else's problem to fix. That's from BNSSG. And Newham, you've put reframing the issue as promoting food security rather than preventing food insecurity. So there's something about language there again. Are there any other more practical pieces of advice? Emily's also popped in there, having a clear call to action, focusing on the small actions that everyone can take, which I think is a really important one. Is the silence because people feel that they've got what they want to have down on there already, or is there a sense of not feeling like that you kind of relate as strongly to this tip, or?
Mine's because I'm thinking.
No, that's fine.
I can't think of anything different.
What's the thinking behind the tip? The tip I can't see the title from where I am, and I was struggling to run both things at the same time. Focus on messages of hope.
So I think it kind of relates a little bit. Well, I was going to say to what you were saying earlier, Anne, about not getting bogged down. You said about getting bogged down by kind of the system stuff, but I think in this sense, it's more about not getting bogged down by kind of how huge these issues are that we're kind of trying to solve, I suppose.
Is there something? Oh, sorry, I know you. I'm just going to say, is there something around thinking about? It's not just about the here and now; it's the future for our sort of children's children. What we're looking at, you know what I mean? That not just about this time.
Yeah. Thanks, Karen. Josh, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was wondering if people are running out of steam, so I thought I might jump in with one. So I think there's something here about having some manageable steps for progress. I think when we've been talking to you about what you've achieved, you all knew up front you weren't going to, save the world and change your whole system all in one fell swoop. But in your theories of changes and your system maps and your plans, you did identify the steps along the way. And I think being able to share those with people, tell people, this is going to be achievable, and then to demonstrate that it has been achieved, I think is a really useful way of supporting this sort of messages of positivity, of hope, that actually, even though it looks really complicated, there is a way through this. I think trying to communicate that's often quite motivating when the going gets tough with chipping away.
Yeah,
I think that's really good, Josh. And I think the way you phrased it as focus on what is achievable makes more sense to me than hope. But I don't know, others might not.
No, that's helpful feedback. Thank you. Let's pop that down in the on the red poster. If people don't have anything more necessarily to add to this one, just conscious we want to be able to properly wrap up, and then Rachel, I don't know, should I hand back to you and then people can carry on adding if they want to?
Yeah, sure. So as I said initially, well, I'll stop sharing my screen. As I said initially, the point of having this session was just to get your input and your thoughts on these tips. I think it was helpful to have a kind of structure of tips there as a jumping off point, but I'm interested to see what has been added to the is anything important missing section. So I'll make sure to reflect that. But I think just before we kind of share next steps and then also let Louise and Josh wrap up too, how do you feel overall about these tips? Are they broadly hitting the right kind of points? Is there anything that's you're kind of like, oh, we haven't captured this, this is missing, da 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 da. Emily.
I think as a range of tips, they're really good. And I think that's the challenge here, isn't it? It's creating something that's short enough, simple enough, engaging enough to capture the key points from the programme. I've put a few things in the potentially missing box, a few things about communication. I think for me, it's interesting that the action scales model hasn't come up at all in our discussion, because it is something that we have used locally to help us prioritise where we should place our energy. But I don't really know where that would come into those 8 tips.
What is the point that sits behind the action scales model, would you say?
For
Knowing where to
me,
focus.
so if you think about like the level of change that you're going to achieve by putting your energy into a certain action, long term, getting things into strategies, brilliant. So that makes you think about what could you do to get this into a strategy or into a policy document that will last long beyond you leaving your role, or thinking about how you can change people's beliefs and what's going to come out of that. It just makes us think differently about all our actions and what we could potentially leverage out of them. So that's the sort of difference, I think, from when we first started working on the project to where we're at now conceptually.
Thank you. And Anne.
I guess my question is about who you think needs to see these and how they're going to get to see them. Because I'd probably give different tips to different groups of people, and I'm not entirely sure who the audience is for this, or if it was us, for instance, at the beginning, how would we have known about these? Where would we have found them, or how would they have been got to us?
Yeah, I think the balance for me with putting these tips together was to create something general and accessible enough that they can speak to multiple audiences, but probably prioritizing a local council audience, but then equally being able to give enough detail and practical advice that they're actually useful. Because I think if it's just the headlines of a tip, you're not really going to get that much out of it, but hopefully by having some of the detail that sits beneath them, as well as some links to resources, that helps people start their journey. I think we've realised though through this work, you can't really shortcut the process. You kind of have to go through it yourself to get out the other end. But maybe knowing that you're in good company and that this is how other people have thought about the process might help. And then to the point about how you see these, Elle might be better placed to answer that one.
Yeah.
In terms of where they're going to be published.
Yeah, sorry, I'm conscious of the time. So they'll be kind of on the LGA website, on the Health Foundation website, alongside information around the programme. And then obviously the webinar that we were talking about, that we emailed about last week, they'll be kind of launched at that, and then hopefully utilised, you know, widely throughout, or kind of brought into conversations with councils that we work with at the LGA, kind of as a kind of legacy piece that goes on beyond the end of the programme. When people start talking about systems change, we'll be able to direct them to the website and to these tips. If anyone has got any other ideas as well, also very, very open to that.
Thanks, Elle. So just to sum up then, next steps are going to be for me to start drafting and write these up. You'll see them again at some point and you'll have the opportunity to share any other thoughts. I think sometimes it's easier when it's written up in a draft to then edit rather than, yeah. And then we'll go from there. I think that was it. I'm just trying to think. If you have more thoughts to add to the Miro board, please do that by Thursday, because that's when I'm going to start writing. And over to Josh or Louise for final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to Elle. Thank you both for facilitating this. From my perspective, felt like a really, really kind of great session. Loads of good energy, loads of great reflections. So thank you. Really briefly from me, just to say there'll be a note shared in the coming weeks, as usual, kind of summarising what's been said from this meeting, and a recording. As mentioned, that'll be shared via the link to the private YouTube channel that we have at Cordis Bray. All that's left, I think, from our side is just to thank all of you for coming along today, engaging so thoughtfully in Josh's presentation at the beginning, and then Elle and Rachel's activity. Thank you not just for your brilliant contributions today, but throughout all of the action learning sets. And looking forward to seeing many of you in person shortly. It's been really fantastic. Thank you, everyone, and we'll leave it there. Thanks ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks
Thanks,
all.
everyone.